everybody, and welcome to the Ill-Fated Wives of Henry VIII podcast. I am absolutely delighted to introduce Natalie Grueninger, and we will be speaking about the trial and execution of Queen Anne Boleyn. How are you today, Natalie?
I'm well. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today.
I'm absolutely delighted. Those of our viewers who aren't aware of it, what are the charges that Anne Boleyn was initially accused of, and which one of these, or all of them, was she actually convicted of?
That's an excellent question because I think there's still quite a bit of confusion around this, actually. So, essentially, she was accused of multiple counts of adultery. So, with Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and Mark Smeaton, as well as incest with her brother George Boleyn. She was also accused of conspiring the king's death. Now, that's an important charge in terms of the Crown's case, because, of course, it's the only one that carries the death penalty. She was, in fact, found guilty of all charges in the end. The trial papers do survive, so we know all the alleged offences. There's lots. There's about 25 counts of adultery that are listed on the indictment. These charges are all said to have occurred over a 27-month period. So basically, her entire reign from October 1533. And they're said to have happened at various locations, including Westminster, Greenwich, Hampton Court, and Eltham Palace. Now, apart from committing adultery, it was also alleged that Anne had in fact encouraged the men with gifts. So she was said to have given them gifts on two occasions, one of which is quite laughably New Year's Eve in 1535, when, of course, the Queen was required to give gifts to her subjects and courtiers. So it's also stated that she had plotted with them, a very dangerous charge. So I quote, she'd plotted the death and destruction of the king. She'd also allegedly affirmed that she had never truly loved the king in her heart and promised to marry one of them once Henry was dead. So they're the charges that are on the indictment. But according to Eustace Chapuis, who's the imperial ambassador, and he is an eyewitness to these events, he says that both Anne and George were also charged with having laughed at the king's dress and I quote, certain ballads that the king had composed. Now, he also states that Anne was accused of poisoning Catherine of Aragon, or of trying to, and of planning to poison the Lady Mary. However, those last charges that Chapuis talks about in his letter to the Emperor Charles V don't in fact appear on the indictment. So he's the only source, so it's difficult to know if she was indeed charged with those. But definitely multiple counts of adultery, incest, and conspiring the king's death are the main charges. And she was very tragically found guilty of all of those particular charges at her trial, which took place on the 15th of May, 1536.
And I just wanted to ask because it's quite a common belief that Anne was formally accused of being a witch, of bewitching the king. There's no mention of this at all, is there?
Oh, that's another fantastic question. No, there's no mention of witchcraft in the list of alleged offences in the indictment. There's a bit of confusion around a letter that exists that appears to suggest that Henry says he was bewitched by her. The problem with this particular letter is that it passed through about four people before it gets to Chapuis, who's the one that reports it, and it's translated, back from English into French into different languages. So we don't know if he meant sorcery when he was discussing the fact that he may have been bewitched by Anne, or whether he was just talking about her charms, to be honest. But no, definitely there is no formal charge of witchcraft in this indictment.
And if we just take a deeper look into the charges of which Anne was found guilty of, do you have any idea of what evidence was brought forth to prove Anne's guilt of these charges?
Yes, I could give you a very short answer to that. And I could say there's absolutely no substantive evidence, but I'll go into it a little bit more. So her trial, as I said, took place on Monday, the 15th of May. It was presided over by her own uncle, Thomas Howard, who was Duke of Norfolk. And because she was a peer of the realm, she was judged by 26 of her peers, as was George Boleyn. So she would have been led into the courtroom, which was in the Great Hall at the Tower of London, by Sir William Kingston and two of the ladies that were there to serve her. Basically, in treason trials in the Tudor times, there's a sort of pattern that they follow. So Anne would have been led in, the indictment would have been read, so all those alleged offences, she would have heard them for the first time. People in the 16th century they were not told the offences beforehand, so they could really not prepare any sort of defence. So she did know quite a few of them already just from conversations in the Tower. However, this is the first time she's hearing the full extent of the charges against her. So it must have been quite a difficult moment for her. She's then asked to plead guilty or not guilty, and Boleyn pleads not guilty to all charges. And then usually the evidence was presented, probably by the Attorney General, who at this point is Sir Christopher Hales. They might then allow the prisoner time to respond. That sometimes happened before the jury actually went off and deliberated on their verdict. Sometimes they allowed the person to speak after the jury had deliberated, but before the Lord Steward pronounced their sentence. So it's possible that Anne did get a chance to speak towards the end. So Christopher Hales would have presented his evidence. Unfortunately, while we do have the trial papers, what doesn't survive is a sort of transcript of what was said. So we don't actually know how it was presented to her, unfortunately. All we have is the actual indictment, which we're assuming he stuck quite closely to. And then she would have been able to respond to those charges. All the records suggest that she, in fact, responded incredibly well and really did clear herself of these charges. But again, we don't have that sort of transcript of what was said. So the evidence, as I say, no substantive evidence. The Crown's case was completely based on hearsay and rumours. Cromwell, though, Thomas Cromwell, prior to Anne's trial, was in one of his letters was talking about this particular case, and he says that Anne's, and I quote, incontinent living was so rank and common, and he goes on from there, that her women were not able to conceal it. So he says that her women were the ones that came to him or to someone else in the King's Council to reveal these facts of Anne's adultery and other charges. Conveniently, though, he also says that he can't give any more details because it's too abominable to discuss. So the Crown is claiming that Anne's ladies were the ones that accused her. Unfortunately, while we've got trial papers, there are no witness statements, preparatory witness statements, and no pre-trial examinations that exist. So it's basically Cromwell's word that we have to believe. Whether there was any interrogations of her ladies, whether they did say anything, we just simply don't know. There were definitely no witnesses produced at the trial. There may have been one witness statement that we hear about, and that is of Lady Wingfield, one Lady Wingfield. So a man by the name of Sir John Spelman, who was there at the time, recorded all of the proceedings in his sort of private notebook or diary, which is now sadly missing, of course. So its contents, however, were seen and transcribed by Gilbert Burnet in 1679. So we have a record of what we think he had in his journal. And he claims that all the evidence was just hearsay, bawdry, lechery. He says that the matter was disclosed by a woman called the Lady Wingfield, who'd been a servant to Anne, one of her ladies, and he says that this was a deathbed confession. So we know Lady Wingfield, the last time she sort of appears in the records is 1534. So if this is the only witness statement, it is the deathbed confession, apparently, of a woman from 1534 who had served Anne. She did know Anne, but it's 2 years old as well. So this appears to be their only kind of evidence that may have been presented. And the sort of diary at that particular page where Spellman's talking about this event had been ripped off as well, says Gilbert. So it's all a little bit suspicious, to be honest. Lady Wingfield was Bridget Wiltshire. She was married to someone at court, so it could be that her husband, after her death, when this matter came out, confessed that his wife had said that, yes, Anne had lived this terrible kind of life. John Hussey, or Hussey, who was the agent of the Lyles were in Calais, he claims that the main accuser was the Lady Worcester. He also mentions one Nan Cobham and one maid Moore. So the Lady Worcester was Elizabeth Brown. She was married to Henry Somerset, the Earl of Worcester, and by all accounts had a very good relationship with Anne. So if she did accuse her of something, it's quite shocking because they were quite close, and it seems that Anne had lent her a sum of money to help her with some issues with her in her marriage. But again, because we don't have any of the transcript of what was actually said in the courtroom, we're just hearing this information from other people. Now, tragically, the only evidence of incest with George appears to be that one day they spent a long time together. That is in her rooms. That is the only piece of evidence that seems to come out. Even Eustace Chapuis, who of course was no friend of the Boleyns or of Anne especially, he actually can't believe that there's nothing substantive in these charges whatsoever. There appears to be no substantive evidence that we know of.
And it's interesting that you mentioned the incest with George, because a lot of people have this rather incorrect assumption that it was George's wife, Jane, that actually accused Anne of having the affair with her brother. And I think that's what a lot of people get from the scene in the Tudors, is that she was involved. But she's actually been made quite of a scapegoat, hasn't she, for the Boleyns' fall and this accusation of incest.
you're absolutely correct. So the confusion has arisen around there's a narrative poem that was written by the secretary of the French ambassador, Lancelot de Carl. So these are people that were there, they're eyewitnesses. However, he chose to write a sort of it's like Anne's story kind of thing, but it's a mixture between a narrative. So it's sort of half fiction, half fact. So it's not your everyday ambassadorial report. He considered himself a poet. So he uses poetic devices in this particular account, which has, of course, confused matters completely. And he speaks of, this is where this comes from, of the one lady, the main accuser, that people have confused to mean that it was Jane Rochford, George Boleyn's wife. He's in fact talking about Lady Worcester, who I just mentioned that John Husey also talks about. So we know that if there was any, it was Lady Worcester, who appears to have said something. We don't know what she said. Like I mentioned, there's no record of her being interrogated. We just have this mention in Husey's letters, and we have this mention in this narrative poem / ambassadorial report from Lancelot de Carl. So absolutely, Jane Rochford, there is no evidence to suggest that she gave any evidence. There is, when George is tried, he's handed a piece of paper and he's said not to read this information out loud because it has to do with the king's impotency. He, in fact, does read it out loud, which makes me love George all the more. But and it seems to appear that he's gotten this information from his wife, that Anne has confessed something about the bedroom habits of the king to her sister-in-law, as you can imagine would happen. And she has told George, and then this is how it's sort of come out. So it's possible that Jane Boleyn was questioned, but you have to consider it from her point of view. Can you imagine how terrifying being questioned by Thomas Cromwell? You know, the pressure he must have put on her. And in that sort of stressful, I know I've had to do witness statements before, and in that stressful situation, you go blank and you sort of say things, and then you're like, oh gosh, what have I said? So it could be that something came out just inadvertently, wasn't meaning to, of course, cause them harm, and perhaps they just used it against her. So you're absolutely correct. The one woman is not Lady Rochford. It is, in fact, Lady Worcester that Lancelot de Carl is referring to. And she has been made a scapegoat. It was just easier to blame things on her than to blame Henry, basically.
And one thing that I find absolutely fascinating to learn more about is Anne's experience in the Tower of London, because unlike some other people who might have been residing there as prisoners, she was still the Queen of England. So, what was her experience like in the Tower? Was she given better living quarters because she was still the Queen and still had her dignity and respect to maintain? Was she given better living quarters? Was she given access to other things that prisoners were not privy to?
Absolutely. And I should just start by saying that our best source of information for Anne's incarceration are the letters of Sir William Kingston, who was Constable of the Tower. Thankfully, a lot of these survive. He was tasked with reporting the Queen's every move to Thomas Cromwell on a daily basis. Unfortunately, the letters were part of the Cotton Library fire that happened in the 18th century. So there has been some damage to them. But again, like John Spellman's notebook, they were seen prior to the fire and they were in fact recorded. So we have the originals and we have transcripts made by early historians. So we get a good idea of what he was actually reporting to Cromwell. So we know that she arrived at the Tower not by the Traitor's Gate, I should say, because of course that's a commonly held misconception. She landed what is today known as the Queen's Stairs, and she alighted from her boat there, walked up the stairs onto the wharf, and then she crossed the drawbridge to the Byward Postern Gate, entered via there, and then it was just a short walk to where she was kept, which was the Queen's apartments. So there is this idea that she was housed in a prison or that she was housed in those nice little timber houses there on the green. That's not correct. She was housed in the Queen's apartments that were in fact refurbished for her coronation. So the Tower, while we think of it now as a sort of prison, was of course originally a palace. So there were her beautiful apartments there. That's where she was kept. So we know that Sir William Kingston was keeping a very close eye on her. He was told to do that, of course, by Thomas Cromwell. She was served by four ladies who were essentially spies. They were not Anne's favourites, she says it herself. These women were Mary Scrope, which was Lady Kingston, the wife of William Kingston, Margaret Dimmock, who was the wife of Anne's Master of the Horse, There was Elizabeth Boleyn, her aunt, who was married to Sir James Boleyn, her paternal uncle. And there was a Mistress Stoner that's caused a bit of confusion. She was possibly the wife of Sir Walter Stoner. So Kingston also reports she had two other gentlewomen. Unfortunately, their identities remain unknown. So she has these four women who are with her constantly. So Lady Boleyn and Margaret Dimmock actually sleep on a pallet next to Anne's bed. So they are with her all the time. She would have had very little privacy. I think she would have spent a lot of time tending to her spiritual needs. We know that when she arrives, she asks Kingston, and I quote, to move the King's Highness that she might have the sacrament in the closet by her chamber so that she can pray. So I think she's spending a lot of time tending to her spiritual needs. She may have been permitted to walk in the Queen's gardens. We know later Lady Jane Grey was prisoner, was given that, was also permitted to walk the garden. So I don't see why Anne wouldn't have been. They were very close to the Queen's apartments. So perhaps she spent some time walking with her ladies. She was absolutely given all honours as Queen because we know that cost of her food and other just sort of necessaries while she's in the Tower amounted to £25, 4 shillings and 6 pence. It's difficult to convert, but it's roughly at least £15,000 that we're talking in. She was arrested the 2nd of May, executed the 19th, so in 17 days. So she is being looked after, fed like a queen, all that kind of thing. We know she has dinners often with Kingston, invites him to talk with her. So she only really had her ladies. What else she had in her apartments, we don't know. What other sort of pastimes, unfortunately. And we know that she fervently maintained her innocence throughout the incarceration, but her behavior was, as expected, erratic. Of course, she was under so much stress. So on some days, she seemed to be quite kind of hopeful. And on other days, she just was not as much. So it was quite erratic, and Kingston comments that he's of this particular behavior. Many people we know that she sees while she's there is, of course, her ladies, William Kingston. She sees her almoner, John Skipp, and she also sees the Archbishop Thomas Cranmer at one point as well. We don't know if she was permitted any other visitors. We know that she wanted to write, so she requests to write a letter to Thomas Cromwell. Kingston unfortunately denies her that and says that she can tell him, verbally tell him what she wanted to say and that he'll pass on the message. So it seems that she wasn't permitted any writing equipment. Of course, she must have wanted to reach out to Henry, but it doesn't appear that she was given that privilege, or at least that the letter got to him. There is a letter that is alleged to be from Anne, but there's a lot of discussion around that particular veracity of that letter. So a difficult time, I would say, in the Tower.
It must have been very frightening to Anne because obviously at this point she has no idea what she's been accused of, what's going to happen to her. And there's a lot of debate over whether she thought she would survive or what was going to happen to her. And that kind of leads me to the debunking of this theory that there was a promise of a reprieve for Anne, that she would be sent away to a nunnery or she would be allowed to live if she agreed to the annulment of her marriage. And I wanted to know whether you believe that was true or not, or whether Henry might have promised this.
That's a very good question. So we know again from Kingston's letters that on the Tuesday, 16th of May, Kingston in fact reports that Thomas Cranmer had been with the Queen that day. So this is the day after her trial. So he knows now that she's being condemned to be burnt or have her head cut off, depending on the King's pleasure. And so we know that he visited. Unfortunately, once again, there is no transcript of what took place in that conversation. But what we do know is that when she had dinner that day, she said that she was in hope of life. And she mentions that perhaps she would just be sent to a nunnery. So we're sort of putting two and two together here. So it seems likely that when Cranmer visited her, he in fact tried to offer her some sort of deal, agree to an annulment, and your life will be spared, something along those lines. Now, what I always wonder is if Cranmer did make this promise, and what we know is the following day, Anne and Henry's marriage is annulled. We know that there was discussion of the legitimacy of their marriage. What I wonder is whether Cranmer actually was aware that the king did not intend to keep his promise and spare her life. I don't know. Cranmer was a supporter of Anne Boleyn. He held her in very high regard, and he's one of only a few people that actually attempted to defend her in a letter, although he realized very quickly that it was an absolute foregone conclusion and that he would only be endangering himself really by continuing to persist. But he did make some comments in her defense, and not many people that survive, records survive, did. So it's difficult to then imagine him kind of being so duplicitous with her. Perhaps he wasn't aware himself of what the king intended. So we know that on the 17th of May, Cranmer has a court at Lambeth, and he declares that the marriage between Henry and Anne is null and void. He says that this is in consequence of certain just and lawful impediments. Now, according to Risley, who's another eyewitness, Anne had confessed to having been pre-contracted to Henry Percy, so the Earl of Northumberland. But this is a claim that he very, very firmly denied himself just days earlier. Whereas Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, says that the marriage had been annulled on account of the fact that the king had had connection with Anne's sister. So that goes back to his affair, however long it lasted, with Mary Boleyn. So Cranmer doesn't actually specify what the annulment grounds are. He just says that there's a just impediment. So the 17th of May is the day that Henry is now free. Their marriage had been annulled. And because Cranmer had visited the day before and Anne had made those comments about being in hope of life, which is so awful and tragic, it seems that there was some sort of deal offered. But of course, we know in the end, it didn't go through with sparing her life. There is some suggestion that she also makes some comments around the fact that she thinks the king's testing her. So she does say this a couple of times, where she feels that perhaps he's not going to go through with anything. It's just a test how faithful she is or whatnot. So, and then other days she's kind of got no hope at all. So it's that very up and down, erratic behavior of someone who's under a huge amount of stress, who's surrounded, you can imagine, by women. And she says that are not my favorites. She actually makes a comment that along the lines of, she thinks it's cruel of the king to put those around her that are not her favorites. She would have had women from her privy chamber. So it's very clear that these women are there just to spy on her. Though it's quite interesting because it does appear that their relationship throughout the incarceration actually changes from one being quite hostile at the beginning to them, if we're to believe some contemporary accounts, being absolutely bereft at the end when they have to witness her execution. And you can sort of see how that relationship might change when you're watching somebody constantly who is affirming their innocence. You know, she invites Kingston to hear mass with her and affirms her innocence on the sacrament at least 2 times. In the 16th century, this is basically proof of your innocence. You know, she's about to go to her death. She would have damned her soul had she been lying at that point. So I think these women slowly start perhaps questioning the thing's justice and maybe wondering, is she in fact completely innocent? So yes, the promise of a reprieve is possible. I think it was possible that that's what Cranmer offered. But like I said, we don't have that exact evidence. We just know that Anne was in hope of life the day Cranmer visited.
And it's so sad because when we look back, we know for in fact that Henry had absolutely no desire of letting Anne live, because I know that I've read somewhere that he got the execution, who was an expert from France, way before her trial had even begun. So it quite shows you that he's quite eager to be rid of her. And I know that you mentioned that it was either she was going to be burnt at the stake or she was going to be executed. And I know that there is a prophecy that I believe Anne was told that a queen of England shall be burnt at the stake. Do you believe that Henry actually considered burning Anne since she was inevitably executed by beheading? Do you believe that this was a form of mercy from Henry, or was this an ulterior motive to show that he had the power or something like that?
Yeah, I think Henry always uses these situations to show that he's the one that's in control. Absolutely, 100%. And you're right, it does appear that the executioner was ordered prior to Anne's trial. Even on the day of Anne's trial, Henry sends a note to Jane Seymour just basically saying, oh, you'll hear from me at around 3 o'clock when, Anne's condemned type thing. That's not verbatim, but the trial was a completely foregone conclusion. The men charged alongside Anne and George had already been tried and convicted. So it's actually farcical. If they're guilty of adultery with the Queen, how can the Queen not be guilty of adultery with them? So it was just a show trial to show that, oh, yes, the Tudor justice system is working properly. But in the end, everyone knew what was going to come out of that. On the 18th of May, so Anne actually thought she was going to be executed on the 18th of May. She was prepared for her end that day. Her brother and the other men had been executed the day before. I think all hope had left her by then once George had been executed. I actually think she quite looked forward to the end in a sort of strange way, just to be done with all that pain that you can imagine she was suffering. On the 18th of May, the king issues a writ from Westminster relating to how and where the Queen would be dispatched. So because, as you mentioned, when judgment was passed at her trial, there were those two options. It would be either her being burnt or her having her head cut off, depending what Henry wanted. So in his actual writ that copy of it survives, he says that moved by pity. So he says, we moved by pity do not wish the same Anne to be committed to be burned by fire. We, however, command that immediately after receipt of these presents to Kingston, upon the green within our tower or London aforesaid, the head of the same Anne shall be caused to be cut off. So he only specifies the form of execution on the 18th of May. Kingston was getting quite nervous because he had no idea whether he had to prepare a stake or prepare a scaffold. For Anne, she's still, even after her execution, referred to as the late Queen. So this is a very high profile case. They know that there's eyes watching from all over Europe, all over the country. So Kingston was quite worried about that. So once he received this particular writ from the king that says she's going to be beheaded, he, in fact, then orders, obviously, the carpenters to come and build the scaffold and all the other things that are necessary for her execution. So was it actual pity that moved Henry to commute her sentence, or was he playing out some sort of chivalric fantasy like Henry always is? So the wonderful Sarah Griswold actually suggests that the choice might in fact have had to do with the sword being connected to that chivalric code that, of course, first kind of bound them and then separated them. So there's no denying Henry was a seasoned role player. He loved to take on roles. And I think during his courtship with Anne, he'd sort of become that courtly suitor. And now, as Sarah Griswold points out, he kind of morphed from Lancelot to Arthur the Wounded. So, but what is undeniable is he wanted to come out of this looking good. He wanted to be seen in the best possible light as a wronged yet merciful prince. I think that's why he chose the sword. I don't think it had really anything to do with him feeling too sorry for Anne. It's of course difficult to know how he felt, but I think it was much more about his appearance and how he's going to be seen coming out of this.
And it's ironic that he did not come out looking good at the end
No,
because we all hate him now. But I think my last question for you, Natalie, would be there's a lot of portrayals about what Anne's final moments were like, what her last day of life was like, how she looked on the scaffold, how she presented herself. Can you tell us a bit more about what her last day of life was like and how she presented herself on the scaffold?
Yes, of course. So I imagine we know that she was prepared to be executed on the 18th of May. And so the night before that, she had spent the entire night in prayer with her almoner, Sir John Skipp. So I imagine she did the exact same thing the night before her execution, all night in prayer. I doubt she would have managed to get any sleep. In the early hours of the 18th of May, she requested that Kingston come and hear mass with her. And he was there himself as a witness, and he watched as she took the sacrament, and she swore that she had never been unfaithful to the king. For, of course, like I mentioned, this is a deeply religious time and people are deeply religious. And this oath that Anne makes is almost to them irrefutable proof of her innocence. And we know that this information gets carried to Chapuis, who reports it almost immediately. So this is a very important moment, I suppose. Anne is, of course, dressed very carefully by her ladies. So she's wearing a grey damask gown edged in fur. She has an ermine mantle and she's wearing what we now call an English hood. Henry had given her £20 to distribute as alms. So she leaves her apartments, the same apartments that she'd spent time in prior to her coronation. So you can just imagine all those thoughts that are going through her mind. Her young daughter Elizabeth is only 2 years old. So she's obviously thinking of them. Her parents are still alive, her sister. All those thoughts as she's walking from the Queen's apartments to the north side of the White Tower, where the scaffold's there. We have records of up to a couple of thousand people kind of crowded around watching. So she mounts the scaffold. She has her ladies with her, the 4 ladies that have served her. And she, of course, delivers the customary speech. But importantly, she does not make any public admission of sin. And like George as well, she does not admit to deserving this punishment. It's a fairly customary speech apart from those two things. People say, why didn't she kind of speak out against the king? It would not have done any good. There was a certain etiquette that you followed on the scaffold. It did not involve saying anything nasty about the king. And of course, she's got Elizabeth to think of. If she angers Henry at that moment, then poor Elizabeth is going to suffer for it and her family. She, as is customary, pays the executioner. the swordsman and offers her forgiveness. Her ladies then remove her ermine mantle and her headdress. It appears her hair was then popped up into a linen cap. She may have been blindfolded. There's sort of contradictory reports. She definitely knelt down in prayer. After she said a few words to the crowd, she knelt down in prayer and was repeating to Christ, I commend my soul, Jesus, receive my soul, sort of over and over and over. There are some records I know that say she kept turning around to see if, the executioner was going to strike. But then there are other records that said she was very, very composed, completely composed, and just, resigned to the end, the fate that awaited her. She was then executed by the sword. It took just one strike of the sword, thankfully, much more merciful than the axe. And then her ladies quickly covered her up and took her for burial to the chapel.
And it's quite sad to think that a woman would be so composed at the thought of, being executed. And as you said, it is quite thankful that she did die by only one stroke. We know that Margaret Pole, goodness gracious, she had many strokes and she was rumored to have said, "Oh, Lord, save me," and things like that. It's quite amazing to think that for all the stress that she had gone through, for all the trouble that she had been forced to live by Henry, that she was mercifully dispatched quite quickly. And it's quite sad to think that, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think her courage is one of the things that always draws me to her. She showed it in life. She shows it at the end. She knows this is her final performance as queen, and she really digs deep and presents herself as an English queen in, every inch the English queen. And she's just very, I think, elegant might not be the right word, but just very composed at that particular moment. And of course, the people watching, there's Thomas Cromwell, there's, the Duke of Henry's son, Henry Fitzroy. There's all people that knew her, the Charles Brandon that had known her since she was a child, 12 years old in France, 13. It's quite shocking that they all just, of course, stood to watch, but no one could have done anything. Henry had made up his mind, so it was a real tragedy. But of course, lots of the people watching end up with the same fate as Anne, not, just a few years after, including Thomas Cromwell himself, of course, who we know begged the king for mercy in one of his last letters, and of course did not receive that mercy either.
And I think it's quite ironic that the person who sent her to her death is the one that could not survive his own death either. And I just wanted to say thank you so, so much, Natalie, for joining us today to talk about this quite interesting subject. I think it's quite horrible to say interesting when we're talking about a woman's death, but she made quite an impact on history. And I think her death is something that we should always talk about and not see in quite the morbid way, but a quite impactful way, because she was the first queen to be executed. And I think that's something that, although she might not wish to be remembered in that way, I think she'd be quite happy to be remembered and not be thought of as this, seductress, this woman who bewitched Henry, but quite the martyr and the victim. And I just wanted to thank you so, so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. Yes, it's a harrowing, tragic story, but I agree with you that, Henry made a big mistake when he thought that she would be forgotten. She's, of course, remembered by so many people from around the world, and I think that is a wonderful thing.
So I just want to say thank you so much to all my listeners, and I hope you're all having a lovely day. This is the ill-fated wives of Henry VIII signing off. Thank you very much.